After the divorce, when he saw she still hadn't left his mansion, her arrogant billionaire ex-husband called her father and mocked, "Come pick up your useless daughter." But 30 minutes later, the gates of his multi-million-used villa opened, and his entire family was thrown out with nothing left to their name. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty wrap every woman in his endless light, blessing her with courage that never fades and peace that no storm can steal. May her hands build hope, her words heal hearts, and her love bring warmth where the world feels cold. She is not just a woman. She is God's greatest masterpiece, the keeper of life, the breath of compassion itself. My precious family, cherish every woman with honor. Her strength holds generations, her prayers guard our days, and her love gives meaning to every sunrise. Respect her, protect her, and celebrate her, for through her heaven touches the earth. If your heart is true, like the video, if your love is real, right, I am with Mr. Peter. The gilded gates of the Walton estate had witnessed many humiliations over the decades, but none quite like this. Grant Walton stood in his marble foyer, phone pressed against his ear, his laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings as he spoke to his ex-wife's father with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences in his life. The divorce had been finalized months ago, yet Shailene Adams refused to vacate his property, clinging to the lifestyle he'd provided like some desperate parasite. He'd been living in the guest house with Tiffany, his girlfriend, assuming his pathetic ex-wife was too weak to start over anywhere else. "Listen, old man," Grant said into the phone, his voice dripping with contempt. "I've been patient. I've been generous. But your daughter is still sleeping in my master bedroom like she owns the place. Come collect her before I have security throw her belongings into the street." He could hear the stammering on the other end, the humiliation in the elderly man's voice, and it made Grant smile. Tiffany lounged on the antique settee beside him, filing her nails, barely listening. She'd heard these rants before. The ex-wife who wouldn't leave, the woman who'd trapped Grant into marriage and now refused to accept her place in his past. "You raised a daughter with no dignity," Grant continued, warming to his subject now. "She married up, way up, and now she can't face returning to whatever mediocre life she came from. Well, I'm done being charitable. You have exactly 1 hour to get here and remove her, or I'm calling the police and having her arrested for trespassing." He ended the call without waiting for a response and tossed his phone onto the marble side table with a satisfying clatter. Tiffany looked up from her nails. "You really think she'll fight you on this?" she asked, sounding bored. "She has no fight left in her," Grant said, pouring himself bourbon from the crystal decanter. "Trust me, I know that woman. She's been defeated for months. She's just too stubborn to admit it." What Grant didn't know was that at that exact moment, Shailene Adams sat in his private study 3 rooms away. The one he never entered anymore because it reminded him of his dead mother. She sat behind the massive oak desk, wearing a cream silk blouse and his late mother's emerald necklace, the one that had supposedly been locked in the family vault. Her lawyer sat across from her, sliding the final documents across the polished wood surface. "Everything is in order," the lawyer said quietly. "The transfer completed an hour ago. The property, the holdings, all of it, it's yours now, legally and irrevocably." Shailene checked her watch. A small smile touched her lips, but it never reached her eyes. 30 minutes, she said. In 30 minutes, everything becomes clear." The lawyer gathered his papers and left through the side entrance, the one Grant never used. Shailene remained at the desk, her fingers tracing the edge of the emerald necklace. She remembered the first time she'd seen it, at a family dinner shortly after her engagement. Grant's mother Cordelia had worn it while telling Shailene, with a sweet smile and poison in her voice, that certain jewelry was meant for women born into the right families. "You understand, dear," Cordelia had said, "these pieces have history. They carry the weight of our bloodline. They're not for, well, for everyone." Grant had laughed. His father, Beaumont, had laughed. His siblings, Ainsley and Fletcher, had laughed. Shailene had smiled politely and said nothing, cutting her steak with steady hands, while something inside her crystallized into pure, patient rage. Now she wore the necklace, and Cordelia lived in a modest retirement facility, her jewelry box empty. The sound of vehicles approaching made Shailene rise from the desk. She walked to the window and watched as the convoy arrived. Security vehicles, the county sheriff, Grant's own lawyer looking pale and shaken, several board members from the family holdings, and finally, Grant's siblings, their faces confused and angry. Shailene descended the grand staircase just as Grant burst through the front doors, Tiffany trailing behind him like an uncertain shadow. "What the hell is going on?" Grant demanded, his voice bouncing off the marble. "Why are all these people here?" The sheriff stepped forward, his expression professional but not unkind. "Mr. Walton, I need you to gather your personal belongings. You have 30 minutes to remove yourself and your guests from this property." Grant stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "Remove myself. This is my house, my property, my estate." "Actually," Shailene said, her voice cutting through the foyer like a blade, "it's not." Every head turned toward her. She stood at the base of the staircase, one hand resting lightly on the banister, the emerald necklace catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Grant's face went from confusion to rage in seconds. "You have no authority here. You're trespassing in my home." "No, Grant," Shailene said calmly. "You're trespassing in mine." She nodded to her lawyer, who stepped forward with a folder thick with documents. Grant snatched it, his hands shaking with fury, flipping through pages that made no sense to him at first. Legal terminology, property transfers, corporate restructuring, and there, over and over again, his own signature. "What is this?" he whispered. "Those are the documents you signed during our marriage," Shailene explained, her voice never rising, never wavering. "Every holiday party where you got drunk on expensive wine, every business dinner where you signed papers without reading them because you trusted your lawyers, every lazy Sunday afternoon when I brought you documents you assumed were household matters and you signed them while watching sports. And yes, there were lawyers who tried to warn you. Do you remember Lawrence? Your attorney who kept asking you to slow down and review the corporate restructuring documents. You fired him for being paranoid and obstructive, and Diane, who flagged irregularities in the estate transfers. You replaced her with someone more agreeable." Grant's face had gone pale. "You tricked me." "I informed you," Shailene corrected. "Every single one of those documents clearly stated what you were signing. You just never bothered to read them. You assumed I was too stupid, too grateful, too intimidated to do anything that might threaten your empire." "This isn't legal," Grant snarled, turning to his own lawyer. "Tell her this isn't legal." The lawyer, a man named Desmond, who'd served the Walton family for years, wouldn't meet Grant's eyes. "It's completely legal. Grant, she used corporate restructuring documents you signed during your marriage. Documents that gave her controlling interest in the estate holdings. The papers are ironclad. I reviewed them myself this morning when she sent them over. There's nothing we can do. You reviewed them this morning?" Grant repeated, his voice strangled. "Why didn't you call me?" "She asked me not to," Desmond said quietly. "And she offered me a position with her new firm at triple my current salary. I accepted." Grant's mind raced back to the lawyers he'd fired over the years. The ones who'd questioned documents, who'd asked him to slow down and review things carefully. He'd dismissed them as overcautious, replaced them with yes-men who wouldn't challenge his decisions. The betrayal hit Grant like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, and Tiffany caught his arm, her own face shocked and calculating. Ainsley, Grant's sister, pushed forward. "This is absurd. The family will fight this. We have resources. We have connections." "You have nothing," Shailene said, turning her attention to Ainsley. "And I'd be very careful about what fights you pick, Ainsley, because I also have documentation of the money you've been taking from the family foundation. The charity funds you've been treating as your personal shopping account. Would you like me to share those records with the authorities, or would you prefer to leave quietly? Ainsley's face drained of color. Fletcher, Grant's brother, tried next. You can't just steal an entire estate. There are laws. I didn't steal anything, Shailene replied. I simply accepted what your brother legally signed over to me. Perhaps if any of you had treated me like a human being instead of hired help, you might have noticed what was happening right under your noses. The sheriff cleared his throat. Folks, I need everyone who doesn't own this property to exit now. That means the Walton family and guests. I'm not leaving, Grant said, his voice desperate now. This is my home. I grew up here. My mother died here. You can't just throw me out. I can, Shailene said, and I am. She nodded to the security team she'd hired. Professional men who stepped forward without aggression, but with absolute authority. Grant looked around wildly, seeking allies, finding none. His own lawyer had betrayed him. His siblings were silent, protecting themselves. His father hadn't even shown up yet, probably still trying to understand what was happening through frantic phone calls. Tiffany released his arm. Grant, maybe we should just go, she said quietly. Go where? He shouted at her. This is everything I have. Ladude, not anymore, Shailene said. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of humiliation. Grant and Tiffany were escorted to the guest house to gather their belongings. His siblings were removed from the property. Neighbors had gathered at the gates, drawn by the commotion, their phones out, recording everything. Grant emerged from the guest house carrying 2 suitcases, his face red with rage and shame. He tried one last time to argue with the sheriff, to demand his rights, to threaten legal action. But every word fell flat against the reality of what Shailene had accomplished. As he reached the gates, forced to walk because even his cars had been registered under the estate holdings, he turned back to see Shailene standing on the front steps of the mansion. Their mansion, his mansion, her mansion now. She didn't grin. She didn't gloat. She simply watched him leave, her expression unreadable, the emerald necklace glinting in the sun. Grant understood, in that moment of utter defeat, that he'd never really known his wife at all. And as the gates closed behind him with a final, decisive clang, he realized something far worse. This was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Patriarch Breaks. Beaumont Walton arrived at the estate gates in his vintage. Bentley, exactly 2 hours after his son's frantic phone call. He'd taken his time, believing this to be another of Grant's dramatic marital disputes that required patriarchal intervention and a firm hand. The Walton men had been handling their women this way for generations. A show of power, a reminder of consequences, and order would be restored. But when the gates didn't open at his approach, when the new security guard informed him through the intercom that he needed clearance from the property owner to enter, Beaumont felt the first tremor of something he hadn't experienced in decades: uncertainty. I am Beaumont Walton, he said into the speaker, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd wielded his entire life. This estate has been in my family for 3 generations. Open these gates immediately. Sir, I have my orders. The owner will see you in the grand ballroom. Please proceed on foot, like a common visitor, like someone without power or position. Beaumont's hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. But he was pragmatic enough to recognize when a battle needed to be fought on enemy territory. He parked his Bentley on the street, where neighbors could see, where it looked like he'd been reduced to waiting outside his own family's property. The walk up the long driveway felt like a funeral march. Shailene waited for him in the grand ballroom, the room where the Waltons had hosted charity galas and political fundraisers for decades. She changed from her earlier outfit into a black dress that made her look like she was attending a wake. In a sense, she was. The room had been transformed. Every piece of furniture removed, except for 2 chairs facing each other in the center of the vast marble floor. Between them, a small table held a single folder. Hello, Beaumont, Shailene said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming," Beaumont repeated, his voice thunderous in the empty ballroom. "You've stolen my family's estate, thrown my son onto the street like a vagrant, and you have the audacity to thank me for coming." "I stole nothing," Shailene replied, sitting in her chair with the grace of someone completely in control. "I simply took what was legally mine, something your family understands quite well, actually. Taking what belongs to others." Beaumont remained standing, using his height as an intimidation tactic that had worked on boardrooms and courtrooms for half a century. "Whatever games you've played with my idiot son's signatures won't hold up under real legal scrutiny. The Walton family has resources you can't imagine, connections that reach into every courthouse, every political office, every institution that matters in this city." "Sit down, Beaumont," Shailene said, her voice quiet but absolute. "Or I'll have security escort you out, and you'll never hear what I have to say. And trust me, you want to hear this before it becomes public knowledge tomorrow morning." Something in her tone made Beaumont hesitate. He'd built his fortune on reading people, on understanding when someone was bluffing and when they held the winning hand. This woman, this girl he'd barely tolerated at family dinners, radiated a confidence that sent ice through his veins. He sat. Shailene opened the folder and slid a single photograph across the table. It showed a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, dated from decades past. The headline read, "Family Displaced in Urban Renewal Project." "Do you know what this is?" Shailene asked. Beaumont glanced at it dismissively. "Ancient history. Urban renewal was common back then. Cities needed to modernize." "This family," Shailene said, tapping the photograph, "was removed from their home with 24 hours' notice. They were told their property was being seized for public development. They were paid a fraction of what the land was worth. They had nowhere to go. What does this have to do with me?" "And that home sat on the exact land where this estate was built," Shailene said. "Your father purchased it through a shell company 3 weeks after the family was displaced. The public development project never happened. It was all paperwork, bribes to city officials, forged documents. Your father stole that land, Beaumont, and he built the Walton fortune on theft." Beaumont's jaw tightened. "You're reaching, making accusations about events that happened before you were even born." Shailene slid more documents across the table. Property records, bank transfers, letters between his father and various city officials. She'd built a case that would destroy everything. "This wasn't an isolated incident," Shailene continued. "Over a span of decades, your father and his associates displaced dozens of families, predominantly black families, through manufactured urban renewal projects. They'd create false paperwork, bribe inspectors to condemn properties, intimidate families into selling far below market value. Then they'd purchase the land through shell companies and develop it for massive profits. The Walton fortune isn't built on business acumen, Beaumont. It's built on systematic theft from people who had no power to fight back." "Even if any of this were true," Beaumont said, his voice strained, "it was my father's doing, not mine. You can't hold me responsible for decisions made before I was old enough to—" "But you continued it," Shailene interrupted. "I have documentation showing you used the same tactics. Different methods, more sophisticated legal maneuvering, but the same fundamental theft. And I have something else." She pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. Beaumont's own voice filled the ballroom, crystal clear, recorded during a family dinner. "The problem with these people is they don't understand their place. They want to live in neighborhoods they can't afford, eat at restaurants they don't belong in, marry into families that should be closed to them." Grant's voice laughing. "Dad, you can't say things like that anymore." Beaumont's voice again. "I can say whatever I want in my own home. And if that woman sitting at our table doesn't like it, she's welcome to leave. God knows she'd be doing us a favor." More laughter. Cordelia's voice, Grant's mother. "Now, Beaumont, be nice. She might be useful for appearances. We need to seem progressive." The recording continued. Ainsley making jokes about Shailene's hair. Fletcher commenting on her education being inferior. Grant saying nothing, just laughing along with his family's casual cruelty. Shailene clicked off the recorder. "I have hundreds of hours like this," she said. "Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every moment you thought you were safe in your own home, saying whatever you wanted because you believed I was too inferior to matter. I recorded everything." Beaumont's face had gone grey. "What do you want?" he asked, the words coming out like broken glass. "I want justice," Shailene said. "Tomorrow morning, 3 investigative journalists will receive complete documentation of your family's history. The stolen land, the displaced families, the systematic racism that built your fortune. There will also be a documentary filmmaker who specializes in generational wealth and how it's accumulated through exploitation. The Walton name will become synonymous with theft and bigotry." "You'll destroy innocent people," Beaumont said desperately. "My grandchildren, my family's legacy." "Your family's legacy deserves to be destroyed," Shailene said, her voice cold as winter. "But I'm offering you a choice. You can sign over your personal holdings to a reparations fund I've established. Every property, every investment, everything in your name. The fund will go directly to the families your father and you displaced, plus educational programs for their descendants. Or you can refuse, and I'll make sure the Walton name is remembered as a cautionary tale about American racism and greed." Beaumont stared at her. This woman he'd dismissed as decoration at family dinners, and saw her clearly for the first time. She wasn't asking. She wasn't negotiating. She was simply informing him of the consequences of a war he hadn't known he was fighting until he'd already lost. "And if I sign?" he asked hoarsely. "Then the story still breaks, but it includes the redemption arc. The Walton family acknowledging their past and making reparations. It won't save your reputation entirely, but it might save you from being remembered as nothing more than thieves." She slid a pen across the table. Beaumont looked at it like it was a loaded gun. His entire life, everything he'd inherited and built, reduced to a signature. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was having his grandchildren grow up with a name that meant shame. His hand shook as he reached for the pen. "They raised you to think you were better than everyone else," Shailene said as he signed page after page. "They taught you that power meant never having to answer for what you took. But power without accountability is just theft with better lawyers. And eventually, someone keeps the receipts." Beaumont finished signing and stood, his body suddenly feeling every single one of his decades. He looked at Shailene with something that might have been respect if it hadn't been buried under so much hatred. "You've destroyed my family," he said. "No," Shailene replied. "Your family destroyed itself. I just made sure you'd finally pay for it." Beaumont walked toward the ballroom doors, each step heavier than the last. As he reached the threshold, his chest tightened. Pain shot down his left arm. The marble floor rushed up to meet him as his body betrayed him the same way his assumptions had. Security called an ambulance. Shailene watched from her chair as paramedics loaded Beaumont onto a stretcher, his face grey, his breathing shallow. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Only the cold certainty that justice, real justice, often looked like cruelty to those who'd never faced consequences before. As the ambulance pulled away, Shailene returned to her chair and pressed play on another recording. This one, Grant's voice from their wedding night, slurred from champagne, talking to his best friend. "She signed everything I put in front of her. My lawyers made sure I'm completely protected. If she ever tries to leave me, she gets nothing. Nothing at all." She'd been listening to that recording for 7 years, letting it fuel her patience, her planning, her absolute determination to dismantle everything these people had built on other people's suffering. Outside, thunder rumbled, and rain began to fall on the Walton estate that was no longer theirs. Chapter 3. The Empire Dissolves. Grant stood in the cramped hotel room he could barely afford, staring at his phone as it vibrated with incoming calls from people he'd once commanded with casual authority. Partners, associates, investors, all of them suddenly unreachable, their secretaries claiming emergency meetings, their assistants saying they'd call back. They never called back. It took him 2 days to understand that he wasn't being avoided by accident. He was being systematically cut off from every relationship he'd spent his adult life building. And when he finally cornered Hollis Pemberton, his longest-standing associate, in the parking garage of their shared office building, the truth came out in a flood of nervous explanations. "Look, Grant, I didn't want to believe it at first," Hollis said, his eyes darting to the exits like he expected an ambush. "But she had documentation. Emails you sent talking about forcing me out of the development deal. Plans to undercut my investment. She had your signature on agreements I'd never seen before." Grant's blood went cold. "What emails? What are you talking about?" "Your own words, man. From your personal account. Talking about how I was deadweight. How you were planning to buy me out at pennies on the dollar, then resell my shares for massive profit. She showed me everything." "I never sent those emails," Grant said desperately. "Hollis, think about it. Why would I sabotage our partnership? We've been making money together for years." But Hollis was already backing toward his car, fear written across his features. "I can't afford to take that risk. I've pulled out of every joint venture we had. My lawyers are already drafting the dissolution paperwork. I'm sorry, Grant, but if there's even a chance you were planning to screw me over, I need to protect myself." Hollis drove away, leaving Grant standing alone in the garage, trying to piece together what was happening. The emails couldn't have been real. He'd never written anything like that, which meant someone had manufactured them, someone who had access to his accounts, his passwords, his entire digital life. Shailene. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His wife of 7 years, who'd sat quietly at his side during countless dinners, who'd listened to him complain about his partners, who'd heard every frustration and grievance he'd ever voiced about the people he worked with. She'd been collecting ammunition. His phone rang. "Another partner, this one not even bothering with pleasantries. I want out, Walton. Whatever poison you've been planning, I'm not waiting around to be the victim. Terminate our agreements, or I'll sue you into the ground." The call ended before Grant could respond. One by one, they all fell away. 12 separate partnerships dissolved within a single week. Some cited the fabricated emails. Others mentioned recorded conversations where Grant had supposedly threatened them. A few simply said they couldn't afford to be associated with his family's newly exposed history of fraud and racism. But not all of them believed her immediately. Cameron Sterling, his oldest associate, had called Grant directly, suspicious of the evidence. "Something doesn't smell right," Cameron had said. "These emails have your writing style, but the metadata seems off. I think someone's setting you up." Grant had felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone willing to question the narrative. "Can you help me prove it?" Grant had asked desperately. "I'm trying," Cameron promised. "Give me a week to gather evidence." But 3 days later, Cameron called back, his voice defeated. "Grant, I found something. Documents showing you've been planning to force me out for over a year. Property acquisitions that would have undercut my developments. I confronted the others, and they all have similar evidence. Even if some of it's fabricated, there's too much smoke here. I can't afford the risk. I'm out." Cameron had been his last hope of solidarity, and even he had ultimately chosen self-preservation over loyalty. The partnerships dissolved anyway, each dissolution coming with financial penalties that Grant hadn't remembered signing. Clauses buried in contracts he'd approved without reading because he'd trusted his lawyers to protect his interests. But his lawyers had been handling thousands of pages of documents, and Shailene had apparently been slipping altered agreements into the stacks of paperwork that crossed Grant's desk daily. Within 2 weeks, Grant Walton went from controlling multiple profitable ventures to being personally liable for millions in penalties and legal fees. Every asset he thought he'd protected was suddenly vulnerable. Every safety net had been cut. He sat in his hotel room, surrounded by legal documents he could no longer afford lawyers to interpret, and felt his entire identity crumbling. He wasn't Grant Walton, successful magnate. He was just a man who'd inherited wealth and assumed it made him untouchable. The knock on his door came late in the evening. Grant opened it to find his sister Ainsley standing in the hallway, her designer clothes looking somehow diminished, her usual confidence replaced with barely contained panic. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past him into the room. Fletcher arrived minutes later, and Grant understood that whatever was coming next would be bad. His siblings never sought him out unless they needed something, and right now they all needed the same thing: salvation. "She's destroying everything," Ainsley said without preamble. "Every holding, every account, every investment. Fletcher and I have been meeting with lawyers trying to find a way to fight this, but it's like she anticipated every move." "She probably did," Grant said bitterly. "She's been planning this for years, while we treated her like furniture." Fletcher paced the small room like a caged animal. "We have to do something. Pool our resources, find better lawyers, go after her for fraud or manipulation or—" "With what money?" Grant interrupted. "She took everything. And she did it legally. I've had 3 different law firms review the documents. They all say the same thing. She used our own agreements against us." Ainsley sank onto the edge of the bed, her perfectly manicured hands shaking. "There's something else," she said quietly. "She knows about the foundation." Grant's stomach dropped. "What about the foundation?" She has records of every transfer I made," Ainsley continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I used foundation funds for personal expenses, every bill I charged to the charity account. She has it all documented, categorized, ready to hand over to authorities." Fletcher had stopped pacing. "She approached me too," he admitted, "months ago. She had evidence of trades I'd made using information from Dad's business meetings. Insider trading, Grant. She could send me to prison. And she offered you a deal," Grant said, understanding blooming like poison in his chest. "She offered you both deals, didn't she?" The silence that followed was confirmation enough. "What did you tell her?" Grant asked, his voice dangerous. Ainsley couldn't meet his eyes. "She said if we testified about the family's history, about Dad's practices, about the stolen properties, she'd give us immunity from prosecution, small settlements to start over somewhere else, protection from criminal charges." "And you took it," Grant said flatly. "You sold out your own family. She was going to destroy us anyway." Ainsley shouted, tears streaming down her face. "At least this way, Fletcher and I have something left. We have a chance to start over without criminal records." "What were we supposed to do?" "Stand together," Grant said. "Fight together. Be a family for once in our miserable lives, instead of scattered rats abandoning the ship." Fletcher's jaw tightened. "Don't act like you're noble, Grant. You brought her into this family. You married someone you never bothered to actually know because she looked good at events and made you feel progressive. This whole disaster started with your arrogance." "My arrogance?" Grant laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The whole family treated her like garbage, and I was supposed to somehow realize she was plotting revenge. She played us all." "She played you," Fletcher corrected. "Ainsley and I just got caught in the blast radius. So yes, we took her deal. We protected ourselves from the consequences of your mistakes." Ainsley stood, smoothing her dress like she could smooth away the betrayal. "The paperwork is already filed. We both gave depositions yesterday. Everything about the family history, the displaced families, Dad's dealings, all of it. It'll be public record soon." Grant stared at his siblings, these people he'd grown up with, played with as children, fought with as adults, and realized he was looking at strangers. The Walton family unity had always been an illusion, held together by money and social standing. Without those things, they were just individuals willing to sacrifice each other for survival. "Get out," Grant said quietly. "Grant," Ainsley started. "Get out," he roared. "Both of you! You want to save yourselves at my expense? Fine, but don't stand here pretending it was anything other than pure self-interest." We're done. The Walton family is done." They left without another word, and Grant was alone again in his hotel room that smelled like disinfectant and failure. He thought about his mother, Cordelia, who'd always preached family loyalty while treating everyone outside the bloodline as disposable. She died believing the Walton name meant something permanent, something untouchable. She'd been wrong about everything. Grant's phone buzzed with another message. Another partnership terminated. Another lawsuit filed. Another piece of his identity stripped away. He thought about the look on Shailene's face when she'd watched him leave the estate. That unreadable expression that gave nothing away. She'd spent 7 years married to him, sleeping in the same bed, attending the same events, meeting the same people. She'd learned every weakness, every relationship, every vulnerability, and she'd weaponized all of it with surgical precision. The scariest part wasn't that she'd destroyed him. The scariest part was realizing he'd never stood a chance, because he'd never seen her as a threat until she'd already won. Chapter 4. The Social Execution. The Metropolitan Gala represented everything the Walton family had spent generations cultivating: power, prestige, and the unshakable belief that certain people simply belonged in certain spaces. The annual event drew every influential family in the city, every social climber desperate for proximity to wealth, every person who mattered or wanted to matter. For 3 decades, the Waltons had been fixtures at this gala, their table positioned prominently near the stage, their name printed in gold on the program as platinum sponsors. Grant arrived that evening in a borrowed suit, having sold most of his designer clothes to pay for his hotel room. Tiffany had agreed to accompany him, though her enthusiasm had waned considerably since his financial collapse. She kept glancing around the entrance hall like she was mapping escape routes. "Maybe this isn't a good idea," she whispered as they approached the ballroom doors. "People are staring. Let them stare," Grant said, though his jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. "I built relationships in this room for years. One disastrous month doesn't erase that history." But the moment they entered the ballroom, Grant understood how completely he'd miscalculated. The conversations didn't just pause when he appeared. They stopped entirely. Heads turned. Whispers erupted like wildfire. And then, with the synchronized cruelty of a practiced social hierarchy, people began turning their backs on him, literally turning their backs. Mrs. Hastings, who'd gushed about Grant's business acumen at the previous year's gala, rotated her chair to face away from him. The Rothford family, longtime associates, suddenly became fascinated with the floral centerpieces. Even the waitstaff seemed to avoid his section of the room. "Grant Walton," a voice called out, dripping with false sympathy. It was Langley Morrison, a rival who'd always been just outside the inner circle of power. "How brave of you to show your face here after everything that's come out about your family." Grant's hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what you've heard, but, oh, everyone's heard everything." Langley interrupted louder now, making sure nearby tables could listen in. "The stolen properties, the displaced families, the generations of fraud. Fascinating stuff, really. Who knew the Walton fortune was built on theft rather than talent?" Laughter rippled through the surrounding guests. Grant felt heat rising up his neck. "Those allegations are documented fact, apparently," Langley continued. "Your own siblings provided testimony. Your father signed confessions. But please do tell us your version. I'm sure it's equally entertaining." More laughter. Tiffany's grip on Grant's arm had loosened, and when he glanced at her, she was looking toward the exits again. "I need some air," she murmured, pulling away from him entirely. She disappeared into the crowd, leaving Grant standing alone in a ballroom full of people who'd once fought for his attention. He tried to push forward, to find someone, anyone, who would acknowledge him as something other than a spectacle. But the crowd parted around him like he carried disease. The Ashbury family, who'd attended his wedding, pretended not to recognize him. The Kensington patriarch, who'd once begged Grant to invest in his ventures, was suddenly fascinated by his dessert. Grant made it halfway across the ballroom before he saw her. Shailene stood near the stage, in a floor-length gown the color of blood, surrounded by the same people who were shunning Grant. They leaned in when she spoke, laughed at her observations, treated her with the exact reverence they'd once shown the Walton family. She looked like she'd been born to this room, to this life, while Grant looked like an intruder. Their eyes met across the crowd. Shailene's expression didn't change, didn't acknowledge their shared history, didn't indicate that she'd spent 7 years married to him. She simply held his gaze for a moment, then returned to her conversation as if he'd never existed. The dismissal hurt more than any insult could have. The gala's master of ceremonies called everyone to attention for the charity auction portion of the evening. Grant found himself pressed against the back wall, unable to secure a seat, while Shailene was escorted to a table at the front. The table that had been the Walton family table for 3 decades. The auction proceeded with the usual parade of luxury items and vacation packages. Grant watched numbly as people bid obscene amounts of money on objects they didn't need, the way he'd done for years without thought. Now each raised paddle felt like a reminder of everything he'd lost. Then Shailene approached the microphone, and the room fell silent with anticipation. "Before we continue tonight," she began, her voice clear and commanding, "I'd like to make an announcement regarding a donation." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Donations were expected at these events, usually accompanied by speeches about legacy and responsibility. "I'm donating $50 million to establish the Justice and Restoration Fund," Shailene continued. "This fund will provide reparations to families who were forcibly displaced during urban renewal projects in this city over the past several decades. Families who lost their homes, their communities, and their generational wealth to systematic theft disguised as progress." The applause faltered, confused. This wasn't the usual feel-good charity speech. The fund will specifically target families affected by fraudulent land seizures perpetrated by prominent local dynasties, Shailene said, her voice steady as a blade. Families who had nowhere to turn when powerful people decided their homes were worth more empty than occupied. She pulled out a folded paper from her clutch. "I'd like to read some of their names, not because they need me to speak for them, but because they deserve to be remembered in spaces they were deliberately excluded from." The ballroom had gone completely silent now. Grant felt ice spreading through his chest as he realized what was happening. The Richardson family, removed from their home to make way for what is now the Walton estate. The Foster family, displaced for the Riverside development. The Coleman family, the Winters family, the Baptiste family. She continued reading, name after name, each one a crime his family had committed, each one a theft that had built the empire he'd inherited without question. "These families didn't just lose property," Shailene said when she finished the list. "They lost futures. Their children and grandchildren should have inherited wealth, stability, opportunity. Instead, they inherited loss, while families like the Waltons inherited fortunes built on that loss." The applause, when it came, was thunderous. People rose from their seats. Some had tears in their eyes. Shailene stood at the microphone like a conductor leading an orchestra of judgment, and Grant understood that he was watching his social execution in real time. "This donation is the beginning, not the end," Shailene continued, "because accountability isn't a single gesture. It's a sustained commitment to unwinding the systems that allowed this theft to happen and ensuring it can't happen again." More applause. The room loved her. They'd turned her into their hero while Grant became the villain of his own family story. He tried to move toward the exit, but Langley Morrison blocked his path. "Phone out. Recording. Any comment, Walton? Want to address what your family did to those people?" "Get out of my way," Grant growled. "That's the same thing your grandfather probably told those families when he stole their homes," Langley said, grinning. The same dismissiveness, the same entitlement. Really drives home that generational damage, doesn't it? Grant shoved past him, no longer caring about appearances or dignity. He needed to escape this room, where he'd once felt powerful and now felt like an exhibit of everything wrong with unchecked wealth. He made it to the lobby before security stopped him. "Sir, we need you to leave the premises," one guard said, his tone professional but firm. "I was invited," Grant protested. "Your invitation has been revoked. Please leave voluntarily, or we'll escort you out." Through the ballroom doors, he could hear Shailene's voice continuing her speech, the applause building to a crescendo. Grant had lost battles before, business deals that fell through, investments that soured, but he'd never been erased like this, removed from his social standing, like a name crossed off a guest list. He left the building and found Tiffany waiting by the valet stand, coat already on. "I can't do this anymore, Grant," she said without looking at him. "I thought maybe you'd bounce back, but it's been weeks and you're just sinking. I can't sink with you." "You're leaving me," Grant said, too numb to feel surprise. "I'm saving myself," Tiffany corrected, "the way everyone else already did. Hollis asked me to dinner tomorrow night. I said yes." She walked away to a waiting car, Hollis's car, Grant realized, and drove off without a backward glance. Grant stood alone on the street outside the gala, listening to muffled applause from inside the building, and understood that Shailene hadn't just destroyed his wealth. She'd destroyed his place in the world, his relationships, his relevance. She'd erased him from the only life he'd ever known. And worst of all, she'd made everyone watching believe he deserved it. Chapter 5. The Hospital Reckoning. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Grant woke up on a bench outside his former estate, unable to remember how he'd gotten there. His hotel had evicted him for non-payment. His credit cards had all been declined. He'd spent the night wandering through neighborhoods he used to own, neighborhoods that had once represented his family's power. And somehow his body had carried him back to the gates of the home that no longer belonged to him. He'd stood there screaming at the security guards about theft and injustice until his voice gave out, until concerned neighbors called for help, until the world started spinning and his legs stopped holding his weight. The paramedics found him collapsed in the street, dehydrated and incoherent, muttering about emerald necklaces and stolen signatures. He woke in Covenant Medical Center with fluorescent lights burning his eyes and the antiseptic smell of institutional care filling his lungs. Every breath hurt. Every thought hurt worse. A nurse checked his vitals with professional detachment, the kind that suggested she'd seen too many people fall apart to be surprised by one more. When she left, Grant tried to sit up, but his body refused cooperation. He felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped away everything essential and left only the brittle shell. That's when he noticed her. Shailene sat in the chair beside his bed, legs crossed, reading a magazine about architecture and design. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than his current monthly income. Her makeup was perfect. Her posture was relaxed. She looked like someone visiting a distant acquaintance out of obligation, not the woman who'd systematically destroyed every aspect of his existence. Grant tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. He reached for the water cup on the bedside table, but his hands shook too badly to grasp it. Shailene watched him struggle for a moment, then set down her magazine and held the cup to his lips. The kindness of the gesture felt like mockery. "Why are you here?" Grant finally managed to croak out. "I paid for your hospital stay," Shailene said, settling back into her chair. "The bills will be covered. You'll receive proper care." "Why?" The word came out desperate, confused. "Why would you pay for anything after what you've done to me?" Shailene tilted her head, considering him with the detached interest of someone examining an insect under glass. "Because I want you alive," she said simply. "I want you healthy enough to feel every single loss, to understand the full weight of what you've lost. Dead men don't suffer, Grant, they just stop. And stopping would be too easy for you." The cruelty of it hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't helping him out of compassion. She was keeping him alive to maximize his pain. "You're a monster," he whispered. "No," Shailene replied, her voice completely calm. I'm a mirror. Everything I'm doing to you, your family did to others for generations. The only difference is that when your grandfather stole homes from families, those families had nowhere to turn, no recourse, no power. They just had to endure the loss and rebuild from nothing. You at least have the privilege of medical care and public sympathy from people who think I've gone too far. Grant closed his eyes, trying to block her out, but she continued speaking. Let me tell you about a dinner party your mother hosted, Shailene said. This was shortly after we got engaged. Your whole family was there, plus several guests. Cordelia was wearing that emerald necklace you love so much. Do you remember what she said to me that night? Grant didn't respond, but Shailene didn't need him to. She said that certain jewelry carries the weight of bloodlines, that these pieces were meant for women born into the right families, not for everyone. Shailene's voice never wavered, but something sharp edged into it. She was telling me in front of everyone that I didn't belong, that I was too inferior to wear the jewelry of your family. And you laughed, Grant. You thought it was funny. I don't remember that, Grant said weakly. Of course you don't. It wasn't important to you. It was just another family dinner, another moment of casual cruelty that rolled off your back because it wasn't directed at you. But I remember every word, every laugh, every dismissive glance. I recorded it too. Would you like to hear it? She pulled out her phone, but Grant turned his head away. I've heard enough recordings. Have you? Shailene asked. Because I have 7 years' worth. 7 years of your family treating me like something they scraped off their shoes while pretending to be progressive in public. 7 years of racist jokes disguised as humor. 7 years of being told, in countless small ways, that I wasn't good enough for your world. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot. For just a moment, her reflection in the glass showed something that might have been exhaustion. 7 years of maintaining perfect composure, of never breaking character, of being 10 steps ahead while pretending to be exactly what they expected. It had cost her things Grant would never understand. Friendships she couldn't maintain, spontaneity she couldn't afford. The simple freedom of not constantly calculating every word and action. But those costs were hers to carry. She'd chosen this path knowing what it would require. She turned from the window, the moment of vulnerability gone, her expression serene again. Do you know what the worst part was? It wasn't the cruelty. People can be cruel. It was the confidence with which you all did it. Like you truly believed you were untouchable. Like consequences were for other people, never for Waltons. Grant felt tears burning behind his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. I apologize, he said, the words tasting like ash. For my family, for my mother, for whatever I did or didn't do to stop it. I'm sorry. Shailene turned from the window, and for the first time since entering his hospital room, she smiled. It was the coldest expression Grant had ever seen on a human face. You're not sorry for what you did, she said. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you're facing consequences. If I'd stayed quiet, if I'd accepted my place in your family as the diversity decoration, you'd still be treating me exactly the same way. Your apology isn't remorse, it's strategy. She returned to her chair and pulled out her phone again, scrolling through images. Speaking of strategy, I thought you should see something. She turned the screen toward him. The photo showed Tiffany and Hollis Pemberton at an upscale restaurant laughing together, her hand on his arm in a way that suggested intimacy beyond friendship. They've been seeing each other for 2 weeks now, Shailene said. Hollis has a penthouse downtown. 3 successful ventures that aren't tied to your family name and a reputation that hasn't been destroyed by generational fraud. Tiffany upgraded, in other words. The same way people upgrade their phones when better models become available. She swiped to another photo. This one showed them kissing outside a theater. They're talking about taking a trip together, somewhere tropical and expensive. The kind of vacation you used to take when you could afford not to think about money. Grant wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He stared at the images of his girlfriend, ex-girlfriend now, he supposed, moving on with his former best friend, both of them clearly unburdened by any loyalty to him. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked hoarsely. "Because you need to understand that nobody is coming to save you," Shailene said, putting her phone away. "Not your family, not your friends, not the woman you thought loved you. Everyone who orbited your life was there for what you represented, not who you were. And now that you represent nothing but loss and shame, they've all moved on." She stood, gathering her purse and magazine. "The doctors say you'll be discharged in a few days. You'll be physically healthy, which is what I paid for. What you do with that health is up to you. You can spend the rest of your life bitter about what you've lost, or you can finally learn what it means to actually build something instead of just inheriting it." Grant watched her walk toward the door. This woman he'd married and never known, this person he'd dismissed as insignificant, who turned out to be the most dangerous opponent he'd ever faced. "Shailene," he called out, his voice breaking. "Please, just tell me it's over. Tell me you're done destroying me." She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and looked back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Oh, Grant," she said softly, "I haven't even finished yet." Then she was gone, leaving him alone in the sterile hospital room with the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears and the knowledge that whatever came next would be worse than anything he'd already endured. Down the hall, nurses gossiped about the patient in room 412 who'd been screaming about stolen estates, the man who'd had everything and lost it all to his own wife. They shook their heads, some with pity, some with satisfaction, that even the privileged could fall. Grant heard their whispers through the thin walls and understood that his humiliation was now entertainment for strangers. This was what complete destruction felt like, not dying, but being kept alive to witness the spectacle of your own irrelevance. Chapter 6. The Generational Theft. Beaumont. Walton had recovered from his first stroke with the stubborn resilience of a man who refused to let his body betray him before he'd secured his family's future. The doctors had warned him about stress, about anger, about the dangers of pushing himself too hard. He'd ignored them all. The Walton legacy was more important than his personal health, and there were still assets to protect, still wealth hidden where that woman couldn't possibly have reached. The offshore accounts represented 3 generations of accumulated wealth, money his own grandfather had stashed away. Accounts that existed in legal gray zones, specifically designed to be untouchable by domestic disputes, divorces, or vengeful ex-wives. Beaumont had overseen these accounts personally, had memorized the access codes, had maintained relationships with the financial advisors in foreign countries who managed the family's most sensitive holdings. This money was supposed to be his grandchildren's inheritance, the foundation upon which the Walton family would rebuild after Shailene's rampage ended. She might have taken the visible assets, the properties and companies that existed in public records, but she couldn't possibly know about the hidden reserves that had been protected through layers of shell corporations and international law, or so Beaumont believed until he tried to access the accounts and found them empty, not reduced, not transferred, empty. Every single offshore holding, every Swiss account, every carefully constructed financial shelter that had taken decades to build, all of it showed zero balances. Transactions dated back months, sometimes over a year, showing systematic transfers to entities Beaumont didn't recognize. Legal entities with names that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant everything to whoever had orchestrated this theft. His first call went to his primary financial advisor, a man named Sterling who'd served the Walton family for decades. "What the hell happened to our accounts?" Beaumont demanded, his voice shaking with rage and fear. The silence on the other end lasted too long. "Sterling." "Answer me, Mr. Walton," Sterling finally said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like guilt. "I tried to reach you several times over the past months. You never returned my calls. I sent registered letters to your office. Your assistant said you were too busy to deal with routine account matters. Beaumont's memory flickered. Vague recollections of messages he'd ignored, letters he'd assumed were standard quarterly reports. I was dealing with a family crisis. What does that have to do with— She had power of attorney, Sterling interrupted. Signed documentation giving her full access to all family holdings, including the offshore accounts. The paperwork was legitimate, bearing your son's signature and notarized by your own attorneys. I flagged it as unusual. I called your office 4 times to verify. Each time I was told you'd approved everything and to proceed with processing. I verified everything before processing the transfers, Mr. Walton. I did my due diligence. Beaumont's vision went dark at the edges. Grant would never sign away access to those accounts. He didn't even know about most of them. Nevertheless, the documents were legal. And there's something else you should know. Sterling's voice dropped lower. She showed me records of what you'd been doing for the past several years. Skimming from the management fees, charging personal expenses to the advisory costs, essentially stealing from the very accounts I was supposed to protect. I had no choice but to cooperate with her, Mr. Walton. You made me an accomplice to fraud. The line went dead. Beaumont stared at his phone, trying to process what he'd just heard. His own financial advisors, people he'd paid for decades, had turned on him, had emptied accounts he'd thought were untouchable, had chosen to protect themselves rather than the family that had made their careers possible. He made 17 more calls that morning, to advisors in Switzerland, in the Cayman Islands, in Singapore. The story was always the same: legitimate documentation, legal transfers, his own signatures authorizing everything. And beneath it all, evidence of his own small corruptions that Shailene had somehow uncovered, using his minor crimes as leverage to ensure full cooperation. By noon, Beaumont understood that the generational wealth he'd been counting on to rebuild the family name had vanished, not just disappeared, been systematically dismantled and redistributed according to a plan he hadn't seen coming until it was far too late. He drove to Shailene's office in a building downtown that used to house one of his own ventures. The irony wasn't lost on him. She'd purchased the property, renovated it, and turned it into headquarters for her own enterprises. The lobby gleamed with modern design, all glass and steel and confident wealth. The receptionist looked at him with barely concealed pity when he demanded to see the owner. "She's expecting you," the receptionist said, which somehow made everything worse. Of course she was expecting him. She'd probably planned this confrontation down to the minute. Shailene's office occupied the entire top floor, with windows overlooking the city that Beaumont's family had once dominated. She stood at those windows when he entered, her back to him, wearing black again, like she was in permanent mourning for something. "The offshore accounts," Beaumont said without preamble. "You stole everything?" "I stole nothing," Shailene replied without turning around. "I simply claimed what was legally transferred to me through proper documentation and authorization. If your son was careless about what he signed, that's not theft. That's negligence on his part. You manipulated him. You tricked him into reading documents before signing them." Shailene turned now, her expression serene. "Into understanding what he was agreeing to. Those aren't tricks, Beaumont. Those are basic adult responsibilities that your son never learned because he assumed money would always protect him from consequences." Beaumont moved closer, his hands clenched into fists. "That money was meant for my grandchildren, for the future of this family. You've stolen from people who haven't even been born yet. People who would have inherited wealth built on theft and suffering," Shailene said. "People who would have grown up believing they were entitled to luxury paid for by other people's displacement and pain. I'm not stealing their future, Beaumont. I'm preventing them from inheriting your crimes." She walked to her desk and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the polished surface toward him. "These are the families your offshore money came from originally. The properties your grandfather seized, sold, and converted into cash that he then hid in foreign accounts. Every dollar in those accounts can be traced back to someone your family victimized. I've spent 2 years mapping the origins of your wealth, and what I found was that there's almost nothing clean in your entire financial history. It's theft all the way down. Beaumont stared at the folder but didn't touch it. I don't care about ancient history. I care about my family's survival. Your family survived for 3 generations on stolen wealth, Shailene said. You'll forgive me if I don't shed tears that you're finally facing the consequences of that theft. The families your grandfather displaced didn't get to worry about their grandchildren's inheritance. They got to worry about where they'd sleep that night after being thrown out of their homes. Your grandchildren will be fine, Beaumont. They'll just have to learn what it means to actually work for what they have. You, self-righteous. Beaumont started forward, rage overriding caution, but Shailene didn't move, didn't flinch. Go ahead, she said calmly. Put your hands on me in my own office, on my property, surrounded by security cameras. Give me one more reason to destroy what's left of your name. I'd welcome it. Beaumont stopped, breathing hard, his chest tight with fury and something else. Something that felt like fear. Why? He asked, the word coming out strangled. Why go to these lengths? Why not just divorce Grant, take your settlement and move on with your life? Why this crusade? Shailene's expression softened slightly, but not with sympathy. With something closer to pity. Because moving on would mean accepting what your family did to me and to countless others as just the cost of existing in your world. It would mean teaching any daughters I might have had that sometimes you just endure cruelty from powerful people because fighting back is too dangerous. I couldn't live with that lesson, Beaumont. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror knowing I had the power to hold your family accountable and chose not to because it was easier to walk away. You've destroyed innocent people in your revenge, Beaumont said desperately. My wife, my daughter, people who never personally harmed you. Your wife made racist comments at every family dinner I attended, Shailene replied. Your daughter treated me like a servant. Your son embezzled from charities. There are no innocent people in your family, Beaumont. There are only people who participated in cruelty and people who stood by and let it happen. Both are guilty. The pain started in Beaumont's chest then, sharp and sudden, radiating down his left arm like lightning. He gasped, stumbling backward, his vision blurring at the edges. Not again. Not now. Shailene pressed a button on her desk, speaking calmly into the intercom. Medical emergency in my office. Call an ambulance. She didn't move to help him as he collapsed onto the expensive carpet, didn't kneel beside him or offer comfort. She simply watched, her expression unreadable, as Beaumont fought for breath and lost the battle. The paramedics arrived quickly, professional and efficient. They loaded Beaumont onto a stretcher, asking Shailene questions about his medical history, whether she knew his medications. She provided what information she had without emotion, like she was reporting on a stranger's condition, rather than watching her ex-husband's father potentially die in her office. As they wheeled him toward the elevator, Beaumont managed to grab one paramedic's arm. My family, he rasped. Someone needs to tell my family. We'll contact them from the hospital. Sir, the paramedic assured him. But as the elevator doors closed, Beaumont caught one final glimpse of Shailene returning to her desk, already opening her laptop to continue whatever work she'd been doing before he arrived. His medical emergency hadn't even interrupted her schedule. The generational wealth was gone. The family legacy was destroyed. And the woman who'd done it all was already moving on to her next task, completely unburdened by guilt or remorse. In the ambulance, Beaumont closed his eyes and wondered if this was how the families his father had displaced had felt, watching their entire world crumble while the people responsible simply moved on to their next victory. Chapter 7, The Family Fractures, Fletcher. Walton's apartment smelled like takeout containers and desperation. The one-bedroom unit in a building that would have embarrassed him months ago now represented the full extent of what he could afford. The furniture was second-hand, purchased from a resale shop where he'd seen people from his former social circle deliberately avoid making eye contact. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbors' arguments, their television shows, their ordinary lives that had once been so far beneath his notice. When Ainsley arrived for the family meeting, Grant had demanded. Her disgust was immediate and obvious. "This is where you're living," she said, standing in the doorway like entering might contaminate her designer clothes. "This is what we can afford now," Fletcher replied, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Or have you somehow managed better accommodations with what's left?" Ainsley didn't answer, which was answer enough. She stepped inside reluctantly, perching on the edge of the sagging couch like she might catch poverty through prolonged contact. Grant arrived last, looking worse than either of his siblings had seen him. His clothes were wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes carrying the haunted quality of someone who'd stopped sleeping properly weeks ago. He'd been staying with a former college roommate who'd taken pity on him, sleeping on a pull-out couch in a basement apartment, the kind of living situation he'd once mocked other people for enduring. "Thanks for coming," Grant said, though his tone suggested he was too tired to mean it. "You said it was urgent," Ainsley replied. "So here we are, the Walton family reunion in Fletcher's tragic apartment. What do you want?" Grant stood in the center of the small living room, looking at his siblings, these people he'd grown up with in mansions and private schools, and saw strangers wearing familiar faces. "I want to know if there's any possible way to fight back," he said. "To challenge what she's done, to reclaim even a fraction of what we've lost. I've been meeting with lawyers, but they all want retainer fees I can't afford. I thought maybe if we pooled what resources we have left—" "There are no resources," Fletcher interrupted. "She took everything that wasn't already spoken for. What little I had in my personal account went to first and last month's rent on this place. I have enough money left to survive maybe another month if I'm careful." "Same here," Ainsley admitted. "The settlement she gave me after I testified was barely enough to cover immediate expenses. She wasn't generous, Grant, she was strategic. She gave us just enough to survive without being able to rebuild. Then we borrow," Grant said desperately. "We reach out to old friends, old associates, people who owe the family favors." "Nobody owes the family anything anymore," Fletcher said, his voice sharp. "The Walton name is toxic. I've tried calling in favors, tried leveraging old relationships. People won't return my messages. The ones who do answer tell me they can't afford to be associated with our family's scandal. We're pariahs, Grant. Nobody's lending money to people who might drag them down, too." "There has to be something," Grant insisted. "Some angle we haven't considered, some weakness in her plan we can exploit." "Stop," Ainsley said, standing abruptly. "Just stop. This isn't a temporary setback we can strategize our way out of. This is permanent. She didn't just take our money, Grant. She took our credibility, our reputation, our place in society. Those things don't come back just because we want them to. So you're just giving up?" Grant asked, incredulous. "I'm accepting reality," Ainsley shot back. "Something you apparently still can't do. She won. She planned for years, anticipated every move, and destroyed us completely. Fighting back would require resources we don't have, and skills we never learned, because we were too busy inheriting wealth instead of earning it." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Grant stared at his sister, seeing the truth reflected in her bitter expression. They'd all been raised to manage wealth, not create it. To maintain systems, not build them. Without the infrastructure their family had provided, they were helpless. "This is your fault," Grant said quietly. "You and Fletcher both. You testified against the family. You gave her exactly what she needed to destroy us publicly. Don't you dare," Fletcher snarled, standing now too. "You brought her into this family. You married someone you never bothered to actually know, because she looked good on your arm and made you feel progressive. Every single thing that happened started with your ego and your carelessness." "I made a mistake," Grant admitted. "But you two committed treason. You sold out your own blood for immunity from prosecution. You chose yourselves over the family. And you wouldn't have." Ainsley challenged. If she'd come to you first, offered you a way out of criminal charges, you're telling me you would have refused out of family loyalty. The same family loyalty you showed when you laughed at every racist joke about your own wife. That loyalty? Grant flinched at the accusation. I never. You always, Fletcher interrupted. Every family dinner, every holiday, every time Mum or Dad made some comment about Shailene being inferior, you laughed right along with them. You treated your own wife like she was lucky to be associated with us. And you wonder why she spent 7 years planning to destroy you. She destroyed all of us, Grant said desperately. Not just me. She went after the entire family. Because the entire family treated her like garbage, Ainsley said. I'm not excusing what she did. I hate what she did. But I understand it. We were cruel, Grant. Casually, constantly cruel. And we got away with it for so long that we forgot cruelty has consequences when you aim it at someone smart enough to fight back. Grant sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. So what now? We just accept this? Live in poverty while she enjoys the life we built? The life we stole, Fletcher corrected quietly. That's what nobody's saying out loud. Shailene didn't just expose Dad's crimes. She exposed that everything we had, everything we thought we'd earned, was built on theft going back generations. We were living off other people's suffering, and we convinced ourselves we deserved it. Silence filled the apartment, broken only by the sound of someone's television through the thin walls. A game show, the host's enthusiastic voice announcing prizes that would mean nothing to the Walton siblings anymore. Mom won't talk to any of us, Ainsley said eventually. I called her care facility. She told the staff to say she has no children. She's cut us off completely. She blames us for losing everything, Fletcher said. Like we were supposed to somehow stop Shailene when Dad and Grant couldn't. Like we were supposed to be better at preserving a legacy built on fraud. Don't talk about Dad like that, Grant said. But there was no heat in it, just exhaustion. Why not? Fletcher challenged. Because it's disrespectful. Because family loyalty demands we pretend his generation wasn't just as corrupt as his father's. We spent our whole lives defending actions we never questioned. Maybe it's time we stopped. Ainsley moved toward the door, gathering her things. I'm leaving. This meeting was pointless. We don't have resources to pool. We don't have a strategy to fight back. And honestly, I don't think we have enough in common anymore to even function as a family. Where will you go? Grant asked. I don't know yet, Ainsley admitted. Somewhere far from here. Somewhere the Walton name doesn't mean anything. I'm thinking about changing it, actually. Starting over with a clean slate. Fletcher laughed, but it was hollow. That's your solution. Run away and pretend you're someone else? Yes, Ainsley said simply. Because staying here, being Ainsley Walton, means carrying shame I didn't personally create, but can't escape from. I'd rather be nobody somewhere else than be a Walton anywhere. She left without saying goodbye, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that suggested she wouldn't be coming back. Fletcher and Grant sat in silence for a long moment, two brothers who'd grown up in adjacent bedrooms in a mansion, who'd attended the same elite schools, traveled on the same family vacations, and somehow become strangers to each other in the process. Do you remember being happy? Fletcher asked suddenly. Actually happy, not just comfortable or satisfied, but genuinely happy. Grant thought about it and couldn't find a memory that felt real. But then something surfaced, a moment from early in his marriage when Shailene had laughed at something he'd said, a genuine laugh that lit up her whole face, before the coldness, before the distance. When had he stopped noticing her laughter? When had he stopped trying to earn it? I remember feeling powerful, he said finally, pushing the memory away. Feeling like I mattered, like I could walk into any room and belong there automatically. But happy? I don't know if I ever really understood what that meant. I think maybe I had chances at happiness and didn't recognize them because I was too busy maintaining status. Me either, Fletcher admitted. We were raised to value status over satisfaction, appearances over authenticity. Maybe losing everything isn't just punishment. Maybe it's also release from trying to maintain something that was never really worth having. That's easy to say when you're trying to make peace with losing, Grant said bitterly. Maybe, Fletcher agreed. Or maybe I'm finally being honest about what we were. We weren't a family. We were a collection of people maintaining a dynasty. And now that the dynasty's gone, there's nothing left to hold us together. Grant stood, ready to leave, ready to return to his borrowed basement apartment and his borrowed future. So this is it. The Walton family ends in a one-bedroom apartment with takeout containers and recriminations. Every family ends somewhere, Fletcher said. Ours just ended more dramatically than most. Grant left without another word, walking down the stairs of the apartment building. Past neighbors who didn't know his name or his history. People living ordinary lives that suddenly seemed impossibly appealing. His phone buzzed with a message from the friend whose couch he was sleeping on. The arrangement was getting uncomfortable. Maybe Grant should start looking for his own place. He stood on the street, the evening air cold against his skin, and realized he had nowhere to go, nobody to call, nothing to return to. The Walton family had fractured completely, each member fleeing to separate corners of their own survival, and the solidarity that was supposed to carry them through crisis had never actually existed. It had always been an illusion, held together by money and mutual benefit. Without those things, they were just damaged people who happened to share a surname that no longer meant anything at all. Chapter 8. The Wedding Night Truth. The Foundation for Educational Equity hosted its annual gala at the Westridge Grand, a venue that had once refused to book events for predominantly black organizations until public pressure forced policy changes. Shailene had chosen it deliberately, the irony not lost on her as she helped organize an evening celebrating scholarships for students from historically marginalized communities. She'd spent the past 2 months building this organization from the wealth she'd stripped from the Waltons, creating something constructive from the ruins of their destructive empire. The gala was meant to be a celebration of those students, their achievements, their futures. It was supposed to be forward-looking rather than backward-dwelling. Grant destroyed that intention when he forced his way past security halfway through the evening. Shailene was mid-conversation with a scholarship recipient, a young woman who'd overcome extraordinary obstacles to earn admission to a prestigious university, when the commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Grant pushed through the crowd with the desperate energy of someone who'd stopped caring about consequences because he had nothing left to lose. "Shailene!" His voice carried across the ballroom, silencing conversations, turning heads. "We need to talk, right now." Security moved to intercept him, but Shailene raised a hand, stopping them. "Let him approach," she said calmly, excusing herself from her conversation. The scholarship recipient stepped back, eyes wide, sensing drama about to unfold. Grant reached Shailene in the center of the ballroom, breathing hard, his clothes disheveled, his desperation obvious to everyone watching. And they were all watching now. 200 guests, donors, students, community leaders, all of them frozen in anticipation of whatever scene was about to play out. "Why?" Grant demanded, his voice cracking. "I need to understand why. What did I do that deserved this level of destruction? What crime did I commit that justified you spending 7 years planning to annihilate everything I had?" Shailene regarded him with the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout every confrontation, every revelation, every moment of his collapse. "You really don't know?" she asked quietly. "No," Grant shouted. "That's what I'm trying to understand. I gave you everything. I married you, brought you into my family, shared my life with you, and you repaid me by destroying everyone I love, everyone who shares my name. So tell me, Shailene, tell me what I did that made me deserve this." The ballroom remained silent, waiting. Shailene could feel the weight of expectation, the anticipation of finally hearing the full story, rather than pieces, revealed through legal documents and media coverage. She took a breath and decided they all deserved the truth. "Our wedding night, Oh, she began, her voice clear and steady enough to carry to every corner of the room. "Do you remember our wedding night, Grant?" Confusion crossed his face. "What does that have to do with—" "Do you remember?" she repeated more forcefully. Grant hesitated, clearly trying to recall details from 7 years ago. "We got married. We had a reception. It was a beautiful wedding. I don't understand what—" "I had an accident that afternoon," Shailene continued. "Nothing serious. I tripped coming downstairs at the venue, twisted my ankle. The doctor gave me pain medication and advised rest. Do you remember that part?" Grant's face showed recognition dawning. "You were on crutches for the photos," he said slowly. "I was on crutches and heavily medicated," Shailene corrected. "The pain medication made me groggy, unfocused. I could barely stay awake through the reception. And when we got to the hotel room that night, you had papers waiting for me." The ballroom was so quiet now that Shailene could hear her own breathing. "You told me they were formalities, standard documents for married couples to sign. You put a pen in my hand and guided it to signature lines while I was barely conscious, while I trusted you completely, while I believed you loved me enough to protect me rather than exploit me." Grant's face had gone pale. "The post-nuptial agreement," he whispered. "The post-nuptial agreement," Shailene confirmed, "which essentially stated that if we divorced for any reason, I would leave the marriage with nothing. Not a settlement based on years of marriage or contribution to the household, nothing. You took advantage of my medicated state to get my signature on documents that would have left me destitute if I'd ever tried to leave you." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Grant shook his head desperately. "That's not— I was protecting myself. Your lawyers advised you to exploit your wife's impaired state on your wedding night?" Shailene asked, her voice cutting. "That was their professional recommendation. Or did they advise you to wait until I was clear-headed and could make an informed decision, and you chose to ignore that advice because you knew I might refuse?" Grant couldn't answer, which was answer enough. "I discovered what you'd done 3 days later," Shailene continued. "When I was clear-headed enough to actually read the documents I'd signed, I realized I'd married a man who would take advantage of my vulnerability for financial protection. A man who claimed to love me but couldn't wait 48 hours for me to be sober before binding me to terms that served only his interests." She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping but still audible to the silent room. "That was the moment I decided to destroy you. Not out of anger or spite, though I felt both, but out of cold recognition that you were dangerous, that you would always prioritize your interests over anyone else's well-being, that you were exactly the kind of person who needed to face consequences because you'd spent your entire life avoiding them." "But it wasn't just that," she continued, addressing the wider room now. "That was the trigger, not the justification. The justification came every single day I spent as part of the Walton family." She turned slowly, making eye contact with different sections of the crowd. "His mother told me at my engagement dinner that black women were only suited for service positions and should never marry into prominent families. She said this while I sat at the table, wearing the engagement ring her son had given me." And Grant laughed. His father laughed. His siblings laughed. They all thought it was funny. Her voice didn't shake, but something raw entered it. "For 7 years, I endured comments about my hair being inappropriate, my education being inferior, my family being common. I was paraded at charity events to make the Waltons look progressive while being treated like hired help in private. I was asked to serve drinks at family gatherings while the actual staff stood by. I was excluded from business discussions while being blamed when investments failed because Grant was distracted by his marriage." Grant tried to interrupt, but Shailene talked over him. Every holiday, every dinner, every family gathering was an exercise in casual cruelty disguised as humor. And you know what the worst part was? Nobody ever apologized. Nobody ever acknowledged that their treatment of me was wrong. They just continued acting like their behavior was normal, acceptable. justified by their wealth and position. Tears were streaming down several guests' faces now, but Shailene's eyes remained dry. So yes, Grant, I spent 7 years documenting every comment, every insult, every moment of racism and disrespect. I recorded your family being exactly who they were when they thought nobody was keeping score. I collected evidence of business fraud, personal corruption, generational theft. And I used all of it to systematically dismantle everything your family built on other people's suffering. The ballroom had become a courtroom, with Shailene as both prosecutor and witness, Grant as the defendant, and 200 people as the jury. But this isn't about revenge, Shailene said, her voice softening slightly. Revenge would have been exposing you publicly and walking away. This is about accountability, about ensuring that families like yours face consequences for treating people like disposable resources, about making sure the wealth you stole from others gets returned to the communities you harmed. Grant's legs seemed to give out. He sank to his knees in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by witnesses, his collapse complete and public. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry for all of it. For the wedding night, for my family, for every moment of pain we caused you. Please, Shailene, please tell me there's a way to fix this." Shailene looked down at him. This man she'd married and learned to understand completely. This person who'd had every advantage and squandered it on cruelty, masked as privilege. There's no fixing this. Grant, there's only moving forward with the understanding that actions have consequences. Even for people who've spent their whole lives avoiding them. She turned to address the room one final time. The foundation for educational equity exists because the Walton family hoarded wealth that should have been distributed generations ago. Every scholarship tonight is funded by money that was stolen from families who never got to see their children attend college, start businesses, build generational wealth of their own. This isn't charity, this is restitution. And it will continue long after Grant and I have both moved on with our lives. Applause began slowly, then built to a crescendo that filled the ballroom. People stood, some crying, some cheering, all of them clearly moved by what they'd witnessed. Shailene had turned her private pain into public purpose, had transformed revenge into restoration. Security finally moved in to escort Grant out of the building. He didn't resist, too broken to fight anymore. As he was led through the crowd, people stepped back, creating a path that felt less like courtesy and more like quarantine. Shailene watched him go, feeling nothing resembling triumph. Just the exhausted certainty that she'd said what needed saying, done what needed doing, and could finally begin moving past the chapter of her life that Grant Walton had dominated. The scholarship recipient she'd been talking to earlier approached tentatively. "Thank you," the young woman said quietly, "for everything you did, for not staying quiet." Shailene managed a small smile. "Thank you for reminding me why any of this mattered, for being the future that makes the present worth fighting through." Outside, Grant sat on the curb in the rain, watching cars pass, understanding finally and completely that the life he'd known was over. Not paused, not temporarily difficult, but irreversibly finished. And the woman who'd ended it had done so with justification he couldn't honestly deny, no matter how desperately he wanted to believe he'd been the victim rather than the architect of his own destruction. Chapter 9. The Last Hope Dies. Grant had been working in secret for months, rebuilding from nothing with the quiet desperation of a man who'd lost everything and refused to accept permanent defeat. The work was humbling in ways his previous life never had been. He took a job as a night janitor at an office building, the kind of invisible labor he'd never noticed when he'd been the one walking past cleaning crews without acknowledgement. The pay was minimal, the hours were brutal, but it was honest work that nobody could take away from him because it required nothing but his body and his time. During those long nights pushing mops across empty offices, Grant had been planning, not revenge. He'd finally accepted that fighting Shailene directly was suicide, but rebuilding, a small venture carefully hidden, something she couldn't possibly know about because he'd learned too late, to be paranoid about what information he shared and where. The opportunity came through Dalton Rivers, his college roommate who'd taken pity on Grant's situation and offered him a couch to sleep on when nowhere else was available. Dalton ran a small consulting firm, nothing glamorous, but profitable enough to provide a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. More importantly, Dalton had an idea for expansion that required capital and business expertise, both of which Grant could theoretically provide if he could somehow secure funding. "I can't put up money I don't have," Grant had admitted during one of their late-night conversations. "But I can offer experience, contacts, strategy. If we structure this right, build it under your name entirely, keep my involvement completely off any official records, maybe we can create something she doesn't know exists." Dalton had been hesitant at first, wary of associating with someone whose reputation had become toxic. "What if she finds out?" Dalton had asked. "What if she's still watching you?" "No, she's moved on," Grant had insisted, wanting desperately to believe it. "She won. She destroyed everything. Why would she still be paying attention to someone she's already beaten?" But friendship and pragmatism had won out over caution. Grant did have legitimate business knowledge, even if he'd previously used it to maintain stolen wealth rather than build anything real. And if they were careful, if they kept Grant's participation invisible, there was no reason Shailene would ever notice a small consulting firm expanding its services. They'd spent months building quietly. Grant worked his janitorial job during the night, then spent his days helping Dalton develop proposals, refine pitches, identify opportunities. It was exhausting, grinding work without any of the luxury or ease Grant had previously known. But for the first time in his life, he was actually creating value rather than just managing inherited assets. And that felt like something worth protecting. The contract they'd landed was modest by Grant's old standards, but represented a lifeline by his current situation. A regional healthcare network needed consulting services for restructuring their administrative operations. The work would take months, provide stable income, and potentially lead to larger opportunities. More importantly, it was completely legitimate. No fraud, no exploitation, just honest labor in exchange for fair compensation. Grant allowed himself to hope, not for returning to his previous life. He'd accepted that was impossible, but for stability, for a future that didn't involve sleeping on borrowed couches and counting pennies for meals, for the possibility that maybe he could rebuild something worth having, even if it was 1,000 times smaller than what he'd lost. That hope lasted until the morning Dalton called him, voice shaking, asking Grant to meet him at their usual coffee shop immediately. Grant arrived to find Dalton sitting at a corner table, documents spread in front of him, his face carrying the expression of someone who'd just watched their future dissolve. "What happened?" Grant asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Dalton pushed a letter across the table without speaking. Grant picked it up, reading quickly, his stomach dropping with each line. The consulting firm had been purchased, sold to an acquisition company for a price that was frankly absurd, 10 times what the firm was actually worth on the open market. The sale had been completed that morning, with all legal paperwork finalized before Dalton had even been notified, beyond a courtesy call from his own lawyers. "I don't understand," Grant said, looking up from the letter. "How can someone buy your company without your consent?" "Remember when we restructured the ownership to bring in that silent investor 3 months ago?" Dalton asked, his voice hollow. "The one who offered capital in exchange for minority stake and voting rights on major decisions?" Grant remembered. They'd needed funding to pursue the healthcare contract, and the investor had appeared at exactly the right moment with exactly the right offer. It had seemed too good to be true, but they'd been desperate enough to accept without excessive scrutiny. That investor, Dalton continued, apparently had clauses in the agreement that allowed them to force a sale if certain conditions were met. Conditions they manufactured by making specific financial moves that triggered the clauses. My own lawyers didn't catch it because the language was deliberately obscured in technical jargon, buried across multiple documents. Who was the investor? Grant asked, though he already knew. Had known the moment he started reading the letter. A shell corporation, Dalton confirmed. But my lawyers did some research this morning after the sale went through. The Shell Corporation is owned by another holding company, which is owned by another entity, which ultimately traces back to Shailene Adams. The coffee shop noises, conversations, espresso machines, background music, all faded to white noise as Grant processed what he was hearing. She knew, he whispered. From the beginning. She knew about the consulting firm, knew about my involvement, knew we were trying to rebuild. She didn't just know, Dalton said bitterly. She facilitated it. That investment capital that let us pursue the healthcare contract. That was her money. She funded our expansion specifically so she could buy us out at the exact moment we were about to become profitable. She let us build something just so she could take it away. Grant stared at the documents, seeing the pattern now with horrifying clarity. Shailene had been watching him even after destroying everything else. She'd known about his secret project, his quiet rebuilding, his single thread of hope. And rather than stopping him immediately, she'd let him invest months of exhausting labor into building something. Let him believe he was finally escaping her shadow. Then simply reached out and claimed what he'd built at the precise moment it was worth claiming. "I'm sorry, Grant," Dalton said quietly. "I know you put everything into this, but the sale is final. The new owners are bringing in their own consultants, their own team. We're both out. I got a settlement that's generous, actually. More than the firm was probably worth. But you—" He trailed off, the implications obvious. Grant had no official ownership stake, no documented role in the company, no legal claim to any settlement or compensation. He'd structured it that way deliberately, to hide from Shailene. And that same structure now meant he walked away with nothing. "She's offering me a position," Dalton added, sliding another document across the table. "At her investment firm. Triple what I was making with the consulting business. She wants me to start immediately." "You're taking it," Grant said flatly. "I have to," Dalton replied. "I have a mortgage, student loans, a life to support. I can't turn down this kind of opportunity out of loyalty to... There's someone who brought this situation on themselves, honestly. I'm sorry, Grant, I really am. But I have to protect my own future." Grant nodded numbly, understanding but unable to feel anything beyond the crushing weight of complete defeat. "There's one more thing," Dalton said, hesitating before pulling out his phone. He opened an email and turned the screen toward Grant. It was from Shailene's lawyer, sent to Dalton that morning, along with the acquisition paperwork. Just 2 sentences. "Please inform Grant that I've been aware of his rebuilding efforts since the beginning. Every move he makes is one I've already anticipated and prepared for." Grant read the message 3 times, each reading making it more real, more final. She hadn't just taken this opportunity away from him. She'd wanted him to know she'd been watching the entire time, that his secrecy had been an illusion, that there was no move he could make that she hadn't already countered before he'd even thought of it. "I have to go," Grant said, standing abruptly. "Congratulations on your new position." "Grant." "Wait!" Dalton started, but Grant was already leaving. Pushing through the coffee shop door into the bright afternoon sunlight that felt like mockery, he walked for hours, no destination in mind, just movement for its own sake. Past the office building where he worked as a janitor, past the apartment complex, where he'd briefly rented a studio before being evicted for late payment. Past the social club where he'd once been a member, now forbidden from entering. Past every landmark of his collapse, seeing them with new understanding. Shailene hadn't just destroyed what he had. She'd been actively preventing him from rebuilding. She'd infiltrated even his secret projects, his hidden efforts, his desperate attempts to create something new from the ashes of his old life. She was always watching, always 10 steps ahead, always ready to pull the floor out from under him the moment he started to regain any footing. By evening, Grant found himself at a small park near the waterfront, sitting on a bench that overlooked the harbor. Boats moved across the water, people walked past with their families. Life continued with its ordinary rhythm that had nothing to do with his personal catastrophe. His phone buzzed. An email from his janitorial supervisor. His position was being eliminated due to budget restructuring. 2 weeks' notice. Grant didn't need to investigate to know that Shailene had somehow influenced that decision too. She was systematically closing every door, blocking every path, ensuring that no matter where he turned, he found her standing there first, having already locked the exit. He sat on that bench as the sun set, watching the sky turn from blue to orange to purple to black, and finally accepted the truth he'd been resisting for months. There was no escape. There was no rebuilding. There was no future where he existed outside of Shailene's awareness and control. She had won so completely that even his attempts to exist independently were things she'd already accounted for and countered. He was finished. Not temporarily defeated, but permanently erased from any version of the life he'd once known or hoped to rebuild. And the worst part was understanding that every bit of this was earned through his own cruelty, his own arrogance, his own failure to treat another human being with basic decency and respect. Chapter 10. The Choice. 2 years passed with the slow, grinding inevitability of seasons changing. Grant Walton, who'd once commanded boardrooms and controlled millions, now carried a toolbox through apartment buildings, fixing broken toilets and responding to noise complaints. The work was honest but unremarkable, the kind of labor he'd never noticed when he'd been the one calling property managers to demand immediate service. The residential building where he worked stood downtown, 12 stories of modest apartments housing people who lived paycheck to paycheck, who worried about rent increases and utility costs, who existed in a world Grant had never understood until he'd been forced to inhabit it himself. He'd taken the property manager position because it came with a small basement apartment as part of the compensation, solving his housing crisis while providing the steady employment that kept him marginally afloat. His hands had calluses now. His back ached most mornings. His wardrobe consisted of work shirts and durable jeans purchased from discount stores. He'd become invisible in the way working people often are, essential to the building's function, but unnoticed by most tenants beyond his utility in solving their immediate problems. He was fixing a radiator in a 4th-floor unit when he got the call from the building owner's office. A heating issue in the penthouse suite needed immediate attention. Grant gathered his tools and took the elevator to the top floor, expecting another routine repair for another faceless tenant. The penthouse door was unlocked. He knocked anyway, calling out his presence, then entered when no one responded. The space was beautiful in the way expensive apartments always are. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, hardwood. Floors, modern fixtures that cost more than most people's cars. The kind of place Grant used to live in, without appreciating. Shailene stood at the windows, her back to him, wearing a burgundy dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread. She didn't turn when he entered. The heating. "Seems fine," Grant said carefully, his voice rougher than it used to be, weathered by 2 years of learning what actual work felt like. "The heating is perfect," Shailene replied. "I asked you here because we need to talk." Grant's first instinct was to leave, to refuse whatever new torture she'd devised. But curiosity and exhaustion kept him rooted in place. "You own this building," he said. It wasn't a question. "I own 12 buildings in the city," Shailene confirmed, finally turning to face him. "This one, where you've been working for 18 months, is one of them. I've owned it the entire time you've been employed here." Grant absorbed this information with the dull acceptance of someone who'd stopped being surprised by how completely his life was controlled by forces beyond his influence. "So what now? You fire me? Find some new way to make sure I can't even maintain basic employment?" "No," Shailene said, her voice steady. "Now I ask you a question, and you answer honestly. Are you satisfied with your revenge?" The question caught Grant off guard. "My revenge? I don't have any revenge. You took everything." "Exactly," Shailene said, moving away from the windows to face him directly. "I took everything. I destroyed your family's empire, exposed your crimes, scattered your relatives, ruined your reputation, and ensured you'd never rebuild what you lost. And now, 2 years later, I'm asking if watching me succeed while you struggle has brought you the satisfaction you were hoping for." Grant stared at her, trying to process what she was actually asking. "I never wanted revenge on you," he said finally. "I just wanted to survive, to exist without you controlling every aspect of my life." "And yet you can't," Shailene replied. "Because I own the building you live in, manage the employment that keeps you housed, know every move you make before you make it. You exist within the parameters I've set, Grant. That's the reality you've been living for 2 years. So why—" "Keep me here," Grant asked, anger finally breaking through his exhaustion. "If you hate me so much, why not just finish the job and destroy me completely?" Shailene's expression softened slightly, though not with sympathy, with something closer to tired recognition. "Because destruction was never the goal," she said. "Accountability was the goal. Justice was the goal. Making sure you and your family faced consequences for generations of harm. That was the goal. Revenge is just what people call justice when it's directed at them instead of others." She gestured to a chair near the window. "Sit down, please. This conversation has been 2 years in the making." Grant hesitated, then sat, placing his toolbox on the floor beside him. Shailene remained standing, maintaining the power dynamic even in apparent conversation. "Your family spent generations treating people as disposable," she began, "building wealth on their displacement and suffering, and you perpetuated that legacy through your own cruelty and entitlement. What I did wasn't revenge. It was dismantling a system that never should have existed and ensuring the people it harmed received some measure of restoration." "I understand that now," Grant said quietly. "It took me too long, but I understand what my family was, what I was." "Do you?" Shailene challenged. "Or do you understand that saying you understand is what I want to hear? There's a difference between genuine recognition and strategic contrition." Grant looked down at his calloused hands, these hands that had learned to fix things instead of just directing others to fix them. "I don't know how to prove the difference," he admitted. "I can only tell you that the past 2 years have taught me more about actual work, actual struggle, actual humanity than my entire previous life did. I'm not asking for forgiveness or sympathy. I'm just trying to survive in whatever space you'll allow me to exist in." Shailene watched him for a long moment, then pulled out a folder from her briefcase. "I'm offering you a choice," she said. "Not because you deserve it, but because I believe people should have the opportunity to become better than their worst moments, even if they rarely take it." She placed the folder on the table between them. "I've established a community outreach program. It works directly with families who were displaced by urban renewal projects, including families your grandfather and father harmed. The program helps rebuild what was destroyed, finding lost property records, establishing legal claims to land, securing reparations, creating educational opportunities for descendants." Grant opened the folder, scanning the program description. "I'm offering you a position," Shailene continued, working directly with these families, helping them navigate systems your family spent generations exploiting. The pay is barely above minimum wage. The work is emotionally difficult and requires genuine humility. You'll be face to face with the human cost of the wealth you inherited. You'll spend years doing unglamorous labor that most people will never notice or appreciate. She paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. This isn't forgiveness, Grant. Forgiveness isn't mine to give. You owe debts to too many people for one person's forgiveness to matter. This is an opportunity to actually earn redemption through consistent action rather than empty words. To spend the rest of your life trying to repair some fraction of the harm your family caused. Grant looked at the program description, seeing his potential future written in job descriptions and program goals. And if I refuse? Then you continue as you are, Shailene said simply. Working as a property manager, living in my building, existing in the small space I've allowed. There's no punishment for refusing, just the choice between comfortable obscurity and difficult accountability. Grant stood, walking to the windows where Shailene had been standing earlier. The city spread out below, full of people living lives that had nothing to do with the Walton family drama. People who'd never heard his name and never would. Why offer this at all, he asked. After everything, why give me any kind of opportunity? Because the cycle has to break somewhere, Shailene replied. Your family harmed others. I held you accountable, and now you have the choice to either perpetuate bitterness or actually contribute to healing. What happens next isn't about you and me. It's about the communities that are still suffering from what your family did. Grant turned from the window, seeing Shailene clearly for maybe the first time since their wedding. Not as his wife, not as his enemy, but as someone who'd transformed personal pain into systematic change, and was now offering him the smallest role in that transformation. I'll take the position, he said. Then be at the center tomorrow morning, Shailene said, gathering her things. The address is in the folder. Don't be late. And Grant, this isn't charity. You'll actually have to do the work. Nobody there will care about your name or your history. They'll only care about whether you're useful. She left without another word, leaving Grant alone in the penthouse with the folder and the weight of choice settling onto his shoulders. The next morning, Grant arrived at the community center, built on the exact land where the Walton estate had once stood. The building was modern and welcoming, designed to serve the neighborhood rather than dominate it. As he approached the entrance, he noticed the cornerstone near the foundation. Carved into the granite was a name, Dorothy Adams. Beneath it, dates, spanning a lifetime and a single line. Her home stood here until 1962. Grant stared at the cornerstone, understanding flooding through him with devastating clarity. Dorothy Adams, Shailene's grandmother, the Walton estate, the home Grant had grown up in, the mansion his family had inhabited for 3 generations. It had been built on land stolen from Shailene's own family. She'd told him at the gala. She'd only discovered this connection during her 7-year investigation, turning what began as personal accountability into generational justice. The wedding night had triggered her investigation into his family's wealth. That investigation had revealed that his family hadn't just harmed strangers. They'd specifically harmed her family decades before she was even born. This had started as one woman refusing to accept exploitation. It had evolved into a granddaughter reclaiming what had been stolen from her grandmother, about dismantling a dynasty built on her family's displacement. Grant stood in the shadow of that cornerstone, finally understanding that the greatest power isn't controlling others or maintaining systems of oppression. The greatest power is rebuilding what others destroyed and ensuring the cycle finally breaks, that stolen land returns to stolen families, that justice, however delayed, eventually arrives. He entered the building to begin the work, of earning something he might never fully achieve. The right to be part of the solution instead of remaining part of the problem his family had created.